Today we are digging into a really significant historical question. What was the actual age of Aisha, the Prophet Muhammad's wife, when they got married? It's a topic that's been debated for, well, centuries in early Islamic history. You've probably heard the most common account, which says she was 9 years old. But here's the question we're tackling. Is that a hard chronological fact, or could it be a major cultural and historical misunderstanding? To figure that out, we've got to put on our historian hats and really dive in. Now, our guide for this whole explainer is a fascinating paper from the West London School of Islamic Studies. They've gathered a ton of historical evidence that seriously challenges that common narrative, and we're going to walk through their case piece by piece. Okay, so first things first. To even get to the bottom of this, we have to travel back in time. And I don't just mean to the 7th century. I mean we have to get into a 7th century mindset. You'll see that the way they understood something as basic as age was just fundamentally different from how we do today. I mean, think about it. Right now, your exact date of birth is everywhere. Your passport, your driver's license, it's a core piece of who you are. But for most of history in pre-modern societies, this idea of a precise, known birthday, it just wasn't a thing for the average person. And this wasn't just an Arabian thing, not at all. Let's take a look at ancient Rome. The historian Karen Cocaine points out that knowing your exact age was actually pretty rare. People would often just round their age up to the nearest 5 or 10. It wasn't a piece of data that you really needed in daily life. We see the exact same pattern way later in pre-industrial England. According to another historian, Pat Fain, systematic birth records didn't even start until 1837. Before that, people just gave approximations. So the big takeaway here is that being imprecise about your age was the norm, not the exception. So let's bring all that context right back to 7th century Arabia. If you don't have a universal calendar for personal stuff, how do you keep track of time? Well, you peg your life to other big, memorable public events. You weren't born in a specific year. You were born in the year of the elephant, or maybe 5 years after the big flood. This is the mental framework we have to keep in mind. All right, now that we have that context set, we can finally open up the historical case file. The source paper we're looking at presents several key pieces of evidence from early Islamic historians and records that, when you put them together, seem to point to a very different conclusion. Just so we're all on the same page, let's get our bearings with this simple timeline. The Prophet's mission begins around 609 CE. The big migration to Medina, the Hijra, is in 622, and the marriage we're talking about happens a year or two after that. So keep those dates in your back pocket as we look at the evidence. Okay, clue number 1. This comes from Al-Tabari, who is one of the most respected early Islamic historians out there. He states very plainly that Aisha and her siblings were all born in the pre-Islamic period, which means before the year 609. Well, if that's true, a little bit of math tells you she would have to be at least 14 or 15 when the marriage happened. And building right on that, 2 of the Prophet's very earliest biographers, Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, both list Aisha among the first converts to Islam. Now, to be a convert, you have to be old enough to understand and choose your faith. If the 9-year-old story were true, she wouldn't have even been born when these lists of early converts were being made. Next up, the paper points us to Aisha's older sister, Asma. Historians like Ibn Kathir tell us 2 key facts. 1, Asma was 10 years older than Aisha, and 2, Asma died at the age of 100 in a very well-documented year. So you can actually do the math. You work backward from that date, and it puts Aisha's age at 19 when her marriage was consummated. And it's not just about the numbers. The historical descriptions of Aisha's actions also raise some big questions. Take the Battle of Uhud, just a year after her marriage. Records describe her carrying heavy water skins on her back to help wounded soldiers. I mean, that's a physically demanding task, one that seems a lot more suited for a young woman in her late teens than for a 10-year-old child, right? And we see it again 3 years later at the Battle of the Trench. She's described as providing comfort to the Prophet on a freezing cold night while he's on guard duty. Once again, the actions we're hearing about sound like they belong to a young woman, not a 13-year-old. So if all of this historical evidence is pointing toward an older age, what do we do with that original story that specifically mentions the numbers 6 and 9? Well, the paper suggests we need to rethink things. Not the authenticity of the story itself, but what those numbers might have actually meant in that culture at that time. First of all, even within the traditional sources, the numbers aren't exactly consistent. You can find different, but equally authentic, versions of the same event that say the age of betrothal was 6, or maybe 6 or 7, or even 9 or 7. You see that variation?
It strongly suggests the numbers are being used as approximations, not as exact data points.
And this leads to a really crucial point about how people even thought about numbers back then. For us, numbers are abstract. A billion is just as real a concept as 10. But in many ancient cultures, numbers were much more tangible, tied to things you could actually see and touch, like, say, your fingers.
And we have a perfect example of this way of thinking from the Prophet Muhammad himself. When he was explaining how many days are in a month, he didn't just say 29 or 30. He actually held up his hands and showed the numbers visually. It's a fantastic example of a concrete, physical understanding of numbers instead of an abstract one.
So the argument from the source paper is this. For 7th century Arabs, numbers under 10 were familiar. They were tangible. Anything larger was a bit more abstract or just many. So it's very possible that using a small number like 9 wasn't meant as a literal year count. Instead, it could have just been a common cultural shorthand for saying, when I was young.
So let's bring all of these different threads together now. The paper argues that when you step back and look at the complete picture, a whole new perspective on this historical question starts to emerge.
Let's recap the case here. We've got the cultural context, that nobody really kept track of their exact age. We have direct testimony from the earliest historians. We've got calculations based on her sister's well-documented life. We have descriptions of her during major historical battles. And when you add in the inconsistencies in the narrations themselves, the source suggests there's a really strong case for a reevaluation.
So, what's the bottom line here according to the paper we've examined? It's this. The combined weight of the historical evidence strongly suggests Aisha was most likely in her late teens. And from this perspective, the numbers 6 and 9 are understood not as exact data, but as culturally understood approximations for simply being young.